where Lot fled when he left Sodom and Gomorrah, the city of refuge. And so this was their city of refuge out here in what wasn't quite wilderness, but we'll call it frontier. Early settlement here in Ohio. And they realized they were in trouble in 1819 and they had to do something. And so they decided to pool resources and become a communal economic institution. My suspicion is it was also strongly influenced by the New Testament, because if you read a little bit in Acts, that was what happened with the early Christians. And some of these other religious groups that we'll talk about did something similar. Again, looking back to the New Testament, trying to follow what was done there, and so that was certainly, I'm sure, part of that decision. Although the crushing debt was certainly a big issue. It sided on the Tuscarawas River, and when the Ohio and Erie Canal came through, it made a big difference for them. Again, a very simple plan. A couple of north-south blocks, square. Very, very simple and very utilitarian and very nice. And of course, the garden we'll talk about just a little bit. When the canal came through, this really saved the group financially, because you could get hard money. You could grow all sorts of food, but it's pretty tough to sell it to someone who has no currency. You can barter around, but that made a big difference. So they were able to pay off the debt. And the canal also brought in tourists. And it also led the young people away too. So it was a mixed blessing, as most things are. And certainly had a big influence on the community. The early cabins, a lot of them, most of them have just a simple gable notch. These are not dovetail notches or half dovetail notches, which are a little more sophisticated. This is pretty simple material. The minor cabin has, just logs, and most of the later ones, a few years later, are shaped a little more accurate. But this was subsistence living, and now of course, we can see the German heritage in the roofing system. Clay tile is just so unusual here in the United States, and that was an aspiration they had. The garden is a very interesting feature, of course. What perhaps I'd be more interested in the fact that they put the garden right in the center of the community. If you look at that grid, it's just right there, front and center, in the very center of the town, where perhaps in most American or early American towns, maybe the church will end up there, and that's not the case here. It's the garden that takes that center spot. And this becomes a bit of a tourist draw. I guess they were good gardeners, and this was a remarkable thing. And the Zoar Hotel, in part because when canal boats had to lay over, you needed a place to stay, but tourists would come as well and see this unique feature. This is what really interests me, because the great estates of the nobility in Europe oftentimes would have what they would call an orangerie, a greenhouse. Growing orange trees in Europe was kind of a big deal. They would have, at Versailles, they actually had these big pots on wheels, and they would bring them into the greenhouse for the winter and keep them going, and then they'd roll them out in the summer, and it was just one of those signs of, I'm a king, I can do this. And so nobility oftentimes would have what they call the orangerie, or the greenhouse, to bring in exotic plants. Palms start showing up in these estates, and they're tapping into that tradition here. Now, I'm sure they saw things like that and said, if we're going to feed this garden we have, we need to do this. But it has a very interesting connection to nobility, and because that's where you saw those features most. The number one house is pretty behind the times when it was built. This is a late Georgian style. It's got the projecting pediment out the front, the hipped roof, belt courses, all the coins on the corners, those little things right there, the stones at the corner, and that was, this would have been up to date and modern in about 1750, 60, 70. It's a little behind the times, at least for American practice. We're into the Greek Revival era and building very different kinds of buildings, but this really, if you could pick up this building and plop it down into some manner in Germany, it would just feel like it belongs there. Very, very similar to the types of things you see there. One of the things that I like about this, I really like vernacular construction. Buildings where people with modest skills are trying to do the very best they can. And there are a couple of these little quirks that are just fun. We have the columns here, which are fairly, a little attenuated, but not too far outside of what's normal. But then where the stairs come up for the portico here, they get really short. That's one of those like no-nos of architecture, that isn't done. But they didn't know that. They obviously had a pattern book. They had something that was guiding them. Pattern books were readily available. Every craftsman would, tuck that pattern book under his arm and go out and, out into the world and practice. And oftentimes, in some cases, we can even tell what pattern book and what edition that they have because we see some of the details. You can actually get that detailed sometimes with those. But so we have these, clearly these were individuals that were trained in architecture offices, such as existed at the time, and you're only going to find that in Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and so forth, maybe Charleston as well. But a great building, and again, it's nice to see these craftspeople just trying to pull out all the stops and really come through with a magnificent building. And you're not going to see this either. This is obviously a cellar in the number 1 house, and you just don't see vaulted floors much in the United States. The only other contemporary one I can think of was just a few years earlier, Robert Mills's fireproof courthouse in Charleston. It was such an innovation to vault it, and they'd had a fire and didn't want another one, and so they specifically asked for him to build it and vault it and so forth. It was just not a skill set that very many builders had here in the U.S. But this is the way you built in Germany, and so they simply followed through with what they did. The nogging in the walls is also another feature that is not used much in the United States. Nogging is brick or stone that you stick in between the studs, and what it does is it increases the thermal flywheel. It means that if it's cold outside and you've got things warm inside, it stays warm. Now, we tend not to do that here in North America because, as you know, it can hit 100 in the summer, and it goes down to, minus 20 or so in the winter time. Germany has a milder climate. They don't have the swings that we do. So, the winter time, we leave out Bavaria, but get up in the Low Countries, your winters are a little milder and your summers aren't quite as intense. And so that thermal flywheel just knocks off the peaks. So it's never going to get that cold inside and never going to get that warm. It just kind of evens things out. Doesn't work in North America because when it was 100 in the day and it only gets down to 80 at night, if you've got stone nogging in your house, it's going to be 90 or more. It's going to hold that heat. It only works well when you have, a fairly regular up and down within a certain spread of temperature. And so, but they built the way they do. And did they freeze in the wintertime a little bit? Well, as long as you have wood to burn and keep things warm, you're fine. But we tend not to do that in North America. We meaning early settlers in the early 19th century tended not to do that. Houses performed usually better in our climate with just that air gap in there to insulate. And because it's great if you're kind of in that springtime or fall temperature range, But once you get into the hot summer or the really cold winter, that noggin, just whatever you have, it just exacerbates it. So this is clearly a technique. The bakery has it as well, and so they were building the way they knew. Well, that's Zoar, and you kind of know Zoar, so let's move on to Talmadge, Ohio. Talmadge was also a utopia, religious utopia. David Bacon was a Congregationalist missionary and minister. He was in the Detroit area, trying to convert the Ojibwa and trying to convert the rather rough lake sailors who sailed around the Great Lakes. Both were a tough crowd, I think. Anyway, he comes down to Ohio and kind of gets permissions, a little bit of backing to do this, and he takes an entire township. Now, I should say one or two things about Talmadge. Talmadge is part of the Connecticut Western Reserve. Remember that the state of Connecticut had a land grant from King George the whomever. I don't remember, it was third or fourth. But anyway, they had a grant. Now, if you take Connecticut and go across, you hit New York. It's like, oh no, but New York was a preceding grant. And then you got Pennsylvania, and William Penn's grant superseded their grant. So then you get to the other side of Pennsylvania, and they wanted to take that little stripe, those two latitudes, and they wanted to run it right across the continent, coast to coast. Now, the other states were going, we don't want a super state. They knew what California was going to do to us already. So they said, no, you can't do that. And so they negotiated a settlement. And since the Revolutionary War was fought mostly in New England, Georgia and the Carolinas, man, they were sunning themselves on the beach all through the Revolutionary War. They didn't cost them a thing. But there were a lot of damage. And so they negotiated and said, listen, okay, we will relinquish political control, but let us sell it. And so those thrifty New Englanders made that happen. And so we are now in this section up in the Connecticut Western Reserve. And so surveyed into ranges and townships. He purchases an entire township, 5 miles square. And he pays to have it resurveyed. And the survey brought everything into the center of town. And so where the church was intended to be and is, the communal economic arrangement was intended to be part of this, partly. There was to be a sheep raising venture that everyone in the township would be part of. Again, trying to have all things in common as the early Christians talked about in the New Testament. And you had to be a Congregationalist to move here. We're going to take Presbyterians, those Baptists, Congregationalists. They were the ones that were allowed. And so he sets up this religious utopia. This is to be this great little community. If I remember right, I think only 12 people bought in. I'm suspicious that if you've got someone intrepid enough to move out to the Connecticut Western Reserve, Ohio became a state in 1804, and you're still clearing roads and so forth, that type of person was not the kind of person that was going to join a communal economic unit and pledge to be a good Congregationalist every day of their life. It just didn't happen. And unfortunately, Bacon defaults. He paid for the land, paid for the resurvey, and he built it, and nobody came. And so back then, when you defaulted, the law practice was that if you bought land from someone who defaults, the land goes back to the original person that owned it. And so everybody had to repurchase their land, no, they not repurchase it twice. They had to, either they paid twice or they repurchased, but not both. But anyway, so they had, this was, Mr. Bacon was not popular because he hid everything. And he goes back to Pennsylvania and passes away in 1817, and Talmadge was kind of a nothing burger at that point. Not many people had come in, but the plan was there. The survey was done, and all of the organization of the land was now according to David Bacon's utopian ideal. And what does happen is Lemuel Porter comes along. He's a Connecticut native and moves out here and builds one of the nicest churches in Ohio. This is this Talmadge Church, 1825. It's really one of the nicer buildings, and so they got that, David Bacon's idea, his concept of the church in the center really did function. And so this must have been the coolest thing on the planet, because anywhere you went in town, you had to go into the center. Get a little gossip, maybe a piece of pie, and it must have just been a really fun place to live with all, this real central focus on the church and the community. Now, Route 19 goes through, I guess it still does,